The hum of the airplane cabin was steady, a mix of soft conversations, the occasional rustling of bags, and the distant voice of a flight attendant making announcements. Passengers were settling into their seats, adjusting their seatbelts, scrolling through their phones, and preparing for the long flight ahead. It was supposed to be just another routine trip. At least, that's what everyone thought. Among them sat a young woman by the window, quietly looking outside at the runway. Her name was Maya. She was in her early 20s, dressed casually in a comfortable hoodie and jeans, her curly hair pulled into a loose bun. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself, but something about her carried an air of quiet confidence. She had taken flights before, plenty of them, so there was nothing unusual about today. At least, not yet. The flight had only been in the air for about an hour when Maya realized she was thirsty. She had been dozing off, the dry air in the cabin making her throat feel scratchy. She pressed the call button above her seat, waiting patiently. A few moments later, a flight attendant approached, a woman in her mid-40s, blonde hair neatly pinned up, her uniform crisp and professional. Her name tag read, Ms. Carter. Maya offered a polite smile. "Excuse me, could I have a cup of water, please?" Ms. Carter's expression didn't shift much, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something unreadable. She folded her arms, glancing at Maya as if assessing whether she was worth the effort. "We're only serving beverages during meal service," she said flatly. Maya blinked. That was odd. She had taken enough flights to know that passengers could always ask for water at any time. Maybe the attendant was just having a bad day. "Oh, okay," Maya said, trying to keep her tone light. "I just need a little water, my throat's really dry." Ms. Carter sighed, clearly annoyed. "Like I said, you'll have to wait." Maya frowned slightly. She looked past the attendant to see another flight attendant a few rows up, handing a cup of water to a different passenger. So, was it just her who had to wait? Something about the way Ms. Carter was looking at her made Maya's stomach tighten. It wasn't just impatience, it was something else. A kind of dismissiveness, like she wasn't worth the basic courtesy of being listened to. Still, Maya wasn't one for unnecessary conflict. She exhaled and nodded. "All right, no problem." She pressed her lips together and turned back to the window, letting it go. But the moment stuck with her. A few minutes passed, and Maya tried to shake it off. Maybe she was reading too much into it. Maybe Ms. Carter was just strict with the rules. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it again. Another passenger, a woman across the aisle, pressed her call button. A different flight attendant came over, and the woman, who didn't seem to be struggling at all, asked for a glass of water. Within seconds, she was handed one with a smile. Maya's fingers tightened around her armrest. So it really was just her. She inhaled deeply, debating whether to say something. Before she could decide, the man sitting next to her, an older gentleman in a business suit, leaned slightly toward her. "That was strange," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Maya glanced at him. He had clearly noticed. She nodded, but didn't respond. Still, the tension inside her grew. She decided to wait. Maybe when they started meal service, she could just ask again. Maybe it wasn't worth making a big deal out of. But then, another moment came, one she couldn't ignore. A little boy in the row ahead of her pressed his call button. Ms. Carter walked over, smiling. His mother asked for a cup of water for him. Without hesitation, Ms. Carter poured some from a bottle and handed it over. Maya's chest tightened. It was so blatant now. It wasn't about the rules. It wasn't about timing. It was personal. She felt a mix of emotions: frustration, disbelief, and something heavier, something that made her stomach turn. She had faced situations like this before, but no matter how many times it happened, it never got easier. Maya took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to cause a scene, but she also wasn't going to sit there and pretend she didn't see what was happening. She pressed the call button again. This time, when Ms. Carter returned, Maya met her gaze directly. "I saw you give water to the passengers around me," she said, her voice steady. "I'd like a cup of water too." Ms. Carter's smile was tight, forced. "I already told you you have to wait." Maya's jaw clenched. "And I'm asking why that rule only applies to me." The words hung in the air between them. A few passengers nearby had turned to listen, sensing the tension. The man next to Maya straightened in his seat, watching. Ms. Carter's expression darkened. "If you have a problem, you can take it up with the airline," she said coolly. "But I don't have to explain myself to you." Maya's heart pounded. She knew exactly what was happening here. And she also knew that people like Ms. Carter counted on passengers like her backing down, staying silent, not making waves. But Maya had learned something a long time ago. Silence only let things like this keep happening. She was about to respond when another voice interrupted. "Excuse me," a man's voice said, firm and authoritative. Ms. Carter turned, and Maya followed her gaze, only to feel a jolt of surprise. A tall man in a tailored suit had stood up a few rows back, watching the interaction unfold. His presence alone commanded attention. Passengers around him turned, sensing that something was shifting in the air. And then, Maya felt her breath catch. She knew that man. It was her father. And what Ms. Carter didn't know, what no one on this flight knew, was that he wasn't just any passenger. He owned the airline. Maya's breath hitched as her father locked eyes with Ms. Carter. The flight attendant, who had seemed so confident a moment ago, hesitated. Something in the way he carried himself, calm, composed, but undeniably authoritative, made the energy in the cabin shift. A few passengers, sensing something bigger was at play, exchanged glances. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to listen but clearly tuned in. Ms. Carter smoothed the front of her uniform and forced a polite smile. "Sir, is there something I can assist you with?" Maya could hear the slight edge in her voice, the way she was trying to regain control of the situation. Her father stepped forward, keeping his expression neutral. "I'd like to know why my daughter is being denied a basic request while others around her have been served without question." Maya's fingers curled into her lap. She had never needed her father to fight her battles, but there was something reassuring about him standing there, addressing it head-on. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about principle. A flicker of something passed through Ms. Carter's face. Annoyance? Discomfort? It was gone in an instant, replaced by a carefully practiced expression of professionalism. "I apologize for any misunderstanding," she said, her voice slightly stiff. "However, our policy states that we distribute water during scheduled service times to ensure fairness among all passengers." Maya's father didn't blink. "And yet, I just watched you serve multiple passengers around her without hesitation." Ms. Carter shifted her weight, her smile now tight. "Sir, if you have concerns, I'd be happy to discuss them after the flight." Maya's father exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much of this moment he wanted to escalate. Then, instead of addressing Ms. Carter again, he turned his attention to another flight attendant nearby, a younger woman who had been observing the situation with nervous eyes. "Would you mind getting my daughter a glass of water, please?" he asked, his voice still calm, but there was an unspoken expectation in his tone. The younger flight attendant hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Of course, sir." She turned quickly, disappearing toward the back of the cabin. Ms. Carter's face darkened slightly, but she didn't argue. It was clear she was starting to realize she had miscalculated something. What she had assumed would be a small, dismissible complaint was suddenly something bigger, something she wasn't in control of anymore. Maya's father studied Ms. Carter for another long moment before finally speaking again. "I suggest you reconsider how you handle situations like this in the future," he said, his voice measured but firm. Ms. Carter's lips pressed together, but she nodded once, stiffly. Maya, watching all of this unfold, felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, frustration, disbelief. She wasn't sure which was strongest. She had spent so many years navigating these kinds of quiet, unspoken dismissals on her own. It was both infuriating and deeply satisfying to see what happened when someone with real power challenged them. The younger flight attendant returned quickly, holding a small plastic cup of water. She handed it to Maya with an apologetic expression, as if silently trying to distance herself from Ms. Carter's behavior. Maya accepted it, offering a small nod of thanks. Then, as her father turned to head back to his seat, she caught his sleeve lightly. "Dad," she said under her breath, "she doesn't know who you are." Her father glanced down at her, a small, almost amused smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I know," he said simply. Then he walked back to his seat, settling in as if nothing had happened. Maya took a sip of the water, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. The moment had passed, but she could feel the way the energy in the cabin had changed. Some passengers were pretending to be focused on their screens or books, but their ears were clearly still tuned in. Others were still stealing glances, murmuring quietly. And Ms. Carter? She wasn't done yet. Maya could feel it. The way the flight attendant stood there for a moment too long, her fingers twitching slightly against her skirt, her eyes flickering between Maya and the aisle. She looked like someone trying to decide what move to make next. Maya's gut told her that this wasn't over. A few minutes later, the flight attendant disappeared toward the front of the plane. When she returned, she was walking alongside another crew member, this one wearing a suit. The flight supervisor. Maya exhaled slowly. "Here we go." The supervisor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a badge clipped to his jacket, approached her row with a neutral expression. He stopped beside Ms. Carter, his hands clasped in front of him. "Ma'am," he addressed Maya, his tone polite but firm, "I understand there was a concern raised about our service. I'd like to personally assure you that our crew is committed to fairness and professionalism at all times." Maya met his gaze evenly. She could already hear the way this was going. A corporate script. A way to smooth things over without actually acknowledging the real issue. She nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," she said, keeping her voice level. The supervisor smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "If there's anything else you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Ms. Carter stood slightly behind him, her expression unreadable. Maya could see the way the situation was being carefully packaged now. The airline wasn't going to admit any wrongdoing, but they also weren't going to escalate this into something public. Not with so many passengers watching. Maya gave the supervisor a small, knowing smile. "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind." The supervisor nodded, then turned and walked away, disappearing toward the front of the cabin. Ms. Carter lingered for half a second before following, her posture stiff. Maya exhaled, leaning back into her seat. The man beside her, who had been silently observing everything, finally spoke again. "Well," he said, shaking his head slightly. "That was something." Maya let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah," she muttered, taking another sip of water. "It really was." But even as the plane continued through the sky, as the meal service began and the conversation slowly shifted to other topics, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was still hanging in the air. Something unfinished. And she wasn't sure if it was just in her head, or if Ms. Carter still had something left to do. Maya stared out of the small airplane window, the clouds outside a blur against the deepening sky. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but her thoughts were louder. She could still feel the weight of what had just happened, the way Ms. Carter had looked at her, the careful way the supervisor had handled the situation without ever truly acknowledging what had gone wrong. It was a familiar kind of resolution, the kind where things were smoothed over just enough to keep everything from falling apart, but never actually addressed at the root. She sighed, her fingers still loosely gripping the plastic cup of water. The ice had melted now, making it seem even more insignificant. Something so small, Yet it had meant so much in that moment. It wasn't just about the water. It never was. The man beside her shifted slightly, glancing in her direction. He had been quiet after his last comment, but now, he leaned in just enough to speak without being overheard. You know, I've seen things like this happen before. They never think anyone is watching. But they always are. Maya glanced at him, taking in the thoughtful look on his face. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, dressed in a button-down and jeans. He had the air of someone who had seen the world enough to recognize its patterns. She gave a small nod. "Yeah," she murmured. "They really are." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "That woman, Ms. Carter. She wasn't just being strict about policy. She didn't like being questioned. Especially not in front of everyone." Maya's grip tightened slightly on the cup. She already knew that. She had felt it. But hearing someone else say it out loud made it more real. Before she could respond, a soft chime rang through the cabin, and an announcement crackled over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be beginning our meal service shortly. Please ensure your tray tables are down if you'd like to receive a meal." Maya let out a slow breath and placed her cup on the tray table, trying to push the lingering tension aside. But as she glanced toward the front of the plane, she caught sight of Ms. Carter again. The flight attendant was standing near the galley, speaking in hushed tones with another crew member. Her expression was tight, her shoulders squared. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't casual conversation. Maya looked away, focusing on her hands. It was fine. The moment had passed. There was nothing else that could happen now. Except, as the meal service began, she realized she was wrong. When the cart finally reached her row, it wasn't the younger flight attendant who had given her the water earlier. It was Ms. Carter. Maya tensed slightly but forced herself to stay neutral. Ms. Carter barely glanced at her as she placed a tray down on the man's table first. Then she turned to Maya, her expression unreadable. "Chicken or pasta?" Her voice was flat, professional, but there was something just beneath it. Maya hesitated for only a second. "Chicken, please." Ms. Carter didn't move right away. Instead, she looked at her for a brief, charged moment. It was quick, probably not even noticeable to anyone else, but Maya felt it. That same unspoken tension, that same quiet resistance. Then finally, Ms. Carter reached for the tray with chicken and set it down in front of Maya. But as she did, her fingers barely brushed against the tray, and the movement wasn't as steady as before. The edge of the tray tipped, just slightly, but enough that the small container of sauce slid forward and nearly spilled over. Maya caught it just in time, stopping it from tipping over completely. A small mess, but nothing disastrous. Ms. Carter didn't say a word. She just moved on to the next row, as if nothing had happened. Maya exhaled slowly. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't enough to call attention to, not enough to cause another scene. But it was deliberate. A small, petty act that no one else would have even noticed. A way of saying, "You might have embarrassed me, but I'm still here." Maya let out a quiet breath and reached for her utensils. Fine. If that was how Ms. Carter wanted to handle this, then so be it. She wasn't going to give her the reaction she wanted. The rest of the meal passed uneventfully, but the feeling of being watched never quite faded. Every so often, Maya would catch Ms. Carter moving through the aisles, her posture always just a little too rigid, her gaze flickering past Maya as if she wasn't there. The man beside her noticed too. "She's not letting this go," he murmured at one point, just loud enough for Maya to hear. Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew the truth. But what neither of them knew was what Ms. Carter planned to do next. The hours passed, the sky outside darkening as the flight continued. People settled into their routines, some watching movies, some reading, others drifting off to sleep. The quiet hum of the plane became the only sound. Maya tried to let herself relax, to stop overthinking everything that had happened. But then, as she reached for her phone, she noticed something strange. The Wi-Fi icon at the top of her screen had disappeared. She frowned, swiping at it. No connection. That was odd. The plane had Wi-Fi for passengers, and it had been working fine earlier. She glanced around and saw a few other people frowning at their devices too, likely noticing the same thing. A moment later, a soft chime rang, and another announcement played. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a temporary issue with our in-flight Wi-Fi. Our crew is working to resolve it as soon as possible. We appreciate your patience. Maya arched a brow. That was interesting timing. She glanced toward the front of the plane. Ms. Carter was standing near the intercom, her back to the cabin. Maya's gut told her this wasn't just a coincidence. Something was happening. And whatever it wasn't over yet. Maya's fingers hovered over her phone screen, her pulse quickening. The Wi-Fi was still down, and something about it felt off. She wasn't the only one who had noticed. A few rows ahead, a businessman tapped his phone impatiently, muttering under his breath. Across the aisle, a teenage girl waved her phone in the air, as if trying to catch a signal. But the plane kept moving forward, silent except for the hum of the engines and the occasional clinking of silverware against plastic trays. The man beside her shifted, lowering his voice. That's strange, isn't it? The Wi-Fi going out right after everything that happened. Maya nodded, keeping her eyes on the front of the plane. Ms. Carter was no longer standing near the intercom. She had disappeared into the galley again, and Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. It was almost like the flight attendant was waiting for something. A flight this long usually had a predictable rhythm. Meals, dimmed lights, people settling in for the night. But the energy in the cabin was anything but relaxed. The tension still lingered, thick in the air. And as much as Maya tried to shake it off, a nagging feeling in her gut told her that this wasn't over. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to look out the window. The view was endless darkness, the occasional flicker of distant city lights breaking through the night below. She didn't know why, but she suddenly wished she could see the ground, feel something solid beneath her. Then, just as she was about to turn away, something strange happened. The overhead lights flickered. It was brief, barely a second, but it was enough. A few people murmured in confusion. Someone even let out a nervous chuckle. Then, as if to reassure the passengers, a voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the temporary disruption. Our crew is aware of the issue and is working to ensure a smooth flight. Thank you for your patience. Maya's fingers curled into her lap. That voice wasn't the captain. It wasn't the co-pilot either. It was Ms. Carter. Her stomach twisted. Flight attendants didn't usually make announcements like that unless something was wrong. And if something was wrong, why wasn't the actual flight crew handling it? The man beside her gave her a sidelong glance. That didn't sound like much of an explanation. Maya barely heard him. Her mind was racing. Something was happening behind the scenes, something they weren't being told. Her first instinct was to stand up, go to the front, and demand answers. But she knew that wouldn't work. If Ms. Carter was involved, she wouldn't let Maya get anywhere near the cockpit. Instead, she pulled her phone out again, flipping to the Notes app. If she couldn't send messages, she could at least write things down, keep track of anything suspicious. But just as she started typing, a shadow moved past her row. She froze. It was Ms. Carter. She was walking slowly down the aisle, her gaze sweeping the cabin. She didn't stop to check on anyone, didn't pause to offer assistance. She was looking for something, or someone. Maya's heart pounded as she ducked her head slightly, pretending to scroll through her phone. Ms. Carter's steps were steady, calculated. When she reached Maya's row, she didn't stop, but she lingered just long enough for Maya to feel her presence. Then, just as suddenly, she moved on. Maya let out a slow breath. That wasn't normal. The man beside her whispered, "She's looking for something." Maya swallowed hard. "No," she murmured. "She's looking for me." A cold realization settled over her. Ms. Carter hadn't let go of what happened. And if Maya was right, she wasn't just being petty anymore. She was planning something. The next 20 minutes felt like an eternity. The plane had gone eerily quiet. Too quiet. It was late now, the lights dimmed for passengers to sleep, but the unease in Maya's chest refused to fade. She kept her eyes on the front, waiting, watching. Ms. Carter was gone again, nowhere to be seen. And then, just when she thought the silence was permanent, a soft rustling sound came from a few rows ahead. Maya sat up slightly. A woman, middle-aged, wearing a gray sweater, was shifting in her seat, her brows furrowed. She seemed uncomfortable, pressing a hand against her temple. Maya frowned. Something wasn't right. Then another passenger stirred, rubbing his eyes as if trying to stay awake. And another. A slow ripple of movement passed through the cabin, people shifting, blinking heavily. It wasn't the normal kind of tired. It was something else. Maya's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't normal. She turned to the man beside her. "Do you feel weird?" she whispered. He blinked at her, then frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "I don't know. It just, something feels off." He rubbed his face, as if suddenly realizing how heavy his eyelids were. "Now that you mention it, I do feel kind of exhausted." Maya's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Her hands gripped the armrests as she scanned the cabin again. More people were shifting in their seats, rubbing their temples, some even leaning their heads back as if suddenly too tired to stay upright. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. Ms. Carter. She was standing near the galley again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant was beside her, whispering something in hushed tones. Then, before Maya could process what was happening, Ms. Carter turned, her gaze locking onto Maya with an expression that made her blood run cold. Maya barely had time to react before the flight attendant moved. She was coming straight for her. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears as Ms. Carter closed the distance between them. The dim cabin lights cast eerie shadows across the flight attendant's face, making her unreadable. Maya forced herself to stay still, her fingers tightening around the armrest. If she panicked, she'd lose control of the situation. But deep down she knew, something was very, very wrong. Ms. Carter stopped just beside her row, her lips curving into a practiced professional smile. But her eyes held something colder. "Miss, you seem a little tense," she said smoothly, her voice almost too kind. "Can I get you anything?" Maya hesitated. The question was innocent enough, but after everything that had happened, she didn't trust it. Her gaze flickered to the man beside her, who was shifting uncomfortably. His eyelids drooped slightly, as if he was struggling to stay alert. It wasn't just him. All around her, more passengers were settling deeper into their seats, heads nodding forward. Whatever was happening, it was spreading. Maya swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Ms. Carter's gaze. "No, I'm fine," she said, keeping her tone even. Ms. Carter tilted her head slightly, studying her. "Are you sure? You seem unsettled." There was an edge to her voice now, a quiet challenge. Maya clenched her jaw. "I just want to get to my destination," she said carefully. "Like everyone else." Something flickered in Ms. Carter's expression. For a moment, Maya swore she saw the corner of her mouth twitch, like she was amused by something. Then, just as quickly, she straightened, adjusting the cuffs of her uniform. "Of course," she said lightly. "We want all our passengers to be comfortable." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing behind the curtain leading to the galley. Maya exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. The man beside her rubbed his temples. "Something's not right," he muttered, voice groggy. Maya didn't answer. She was already pulling her phone out again, even though she knew there was no service. She needed to document this. Something was happening, and she wasn't about to sit back and let it unfold without understanding why. But before she could type anything, the intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice said, and Maya immediately knew it wasn't the captain. It wasn't even one of the usual crew members. It was Ms. Carter. "We apologize for any discomfort," she continued, her voice smooth, practiced. "Due to unexpected turbulence earlier, some of you may be experiencing mild dizziness or fatigue. Please remain seated and rest. Our crew is here to assist you." Maya's stomach twisted. Turbulence? That was a lie. There hadn't been any turbulence. She looked around the cabin, searching for anyone else who seemed alarmed, but most passengers were too groggy to react. It was like they had been lulled into a trance. She turned back to the man beside her, shaking his shoulder lightly. "Hey," she whispered. "Stay awake." He blinked at her, dazed. "What?" "Something's happening," she said urgently. "Don't fall asleep." His brows knitted together, but he nodded slowly, forcing himself to sit up straighter. Maya's mind raced. She needed answers. She needed to know what was happening behind that curtain. Summoning every ounce of courage, she unbuckled her seatbelt, careful not to make any sudden movements. If Ms. Carter or any of the other flight attendants were watching, she couldn't give them a reason to stop her. She slipped into the aisle, keeping her steps quiet as she moved toward the front of the plane. Her heart pounded as she neared the galley, where the curtain swayed slightly from recent movement. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. No one was stopping her. She pushed forward, reaching out and slowly peeling the curtain back. And then she saw it. A small, open compartment tucked behind the beverage cart, half hidden from passenger view. Inside, several empty vials lay scattered, along with a small, folded document. Maya's breath hitched. She recognized those vials. Her father had warned her about them before. He had spoken about unethical airline practices, companies that cut corners to manage passengers on long-haul flights. But this was something else. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the document, unfolding it carefully. The words blurred in the dim lighting, but one line stood out, bold and clear. Administer dosage only under direct authorization. Maya's stomach dropped. She didn't have time to process it before she heard a sharp inhale behind her. She spun around. Ms. Carter stood just a few feet away, her expression unreadable. But this time, there was no polite mask, no forced customer service smile. Her eyes were cold, calculated. Maya gripped the paper tightly, refusing to back down. Ms. Carter took a slow step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Maya's heart pounded, but she lifted her chin. "What did you do to them?" Ms. Carter tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. "Nothing harmful," she said lightly. "Just making sure things remain orderly." Maya's breath caught. She knew that tone, that careful, dismissive wording. It wasn't just about keeping order. It was about control. And now, she was in the middle of something far bigger than she had realized. Maya's breath was shallow, her mind racing as she stared at Ms. Carter. The flight attendant's posture was eerily calm, like she had all the control in the world. But Maya wasn't about to let that stand. She clenched the paper tighter, heart pounding. "You're drugging passengers," she said, her voice low but firm. "Why?" Ms. Carter let out a quiet sigh, almost as if she was disappointed. "You really shouldn't have seen that," she murmured. This was supposed to be a smooth flight. Maya could feel the tension thickening around them. She had two choices: play along and pretend to know nothing, or make a move now. The second option was risky, but she had no time left. Her fingers darted to her phone, quickly snapping a photo of the vials and document. Ms. Carter's expression darkened. "That was a mistake," she said, stepping closer. Maya didn't hesitate. She shoved the curtain aside and bolted back toward her seat, her pulse hammering. She heard footsteps behind her. Fast, determined. She couldn't let herself get stopped. Maya burst into the aisle just as the plane jerked slightly, the pilot's voice coming over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our final descent shortly." It was now or never. She turned toward the passengers, raising her voice. "Something's wrong," she called out, lifting her phone. "They're drugging people." A few heads turned sluggishly, but others started snapping to attention. Confusion flickered across tired faces. The man beside her, still fighting off whatever effect had been forced on him, frowned. "What?" Ms. Carter appeared in the aisle, her expression hard. "Sit down, miss," she ordered, her voice clipped. "You're causing unnecessary panic." But now, others were watching, whispering. Maya didn't back down. "Look at your own flight attendants," she pressed. "They're not tired, are they? Only the passengers are." More people were stirring now, blinking, shaking their heads as if trying to clear a fog. And then, a voice from first class rang out. "I want to see the captain." Heads turned toward the front of the plane. A man in a tailored suit stood up, steady and strong, someone who hadn't been affected like the others. Maya's breath hitched. Her father. Ms. Carter's entire demeanor shifted. The control she had a moment ago evaporated as realization dawned on her face. Maya's father's voice was sharp, unwavering. "I own this airline," he said, eyes locked on Ms. Carter. "And I demand an explanation. Now." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Ms. Carter took a small step back, her expression flickering between panic and calculation. "Sir, there's no issue here." "Then why are my passengers drugged?" he interrupted coldly. "And don't lie to me." Maya watched the entire flight shift. Flight attendants glanced at each other, uncertain. Passengers who had been groggy a minute ago were waking up fully, realization dawning in their eyes. The power balance had changed. Ms. Carter opened her mouth, but she had lost. The pilot's voice crackled over the speaker again, this time with urgency. "We have been informed of a security issue on board. Authorities will be waiting upon landing." Ms. Carter's face went pale. Maya's father turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but there was something like pride in his eyes. "You did good," he said quietly. Maya let out a shaky breath. The danger wasn't over, but one thing was clear. Ms. Carter had messed with the wrong passenger. As the plane began its descent, Maya finally allowed herself to take a deep breath. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on her, but she knew she couldn't let her guard down just yet. The whispers among the passengers had grown louder, a mixture of confusion and anger spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Some were still shaking off the effects of whatever had been given to them, while others exchanged glances, trying to piece everything together. Ms. Carter stood frozen in the aisle, her confident demeanor completely shattered. She seemed to be calculating her next move, but there was nowhere left to run. Maya's father hadn't taken his eyes off her, his presence alone enough to send a clear message. This was far from over. Maya's heart pounded as she watched the other flight attendants. Some of them looked genuinely confused, as if they hadn't known what was happening. Others looked nervous, shifting uncomfortably under the scrutiny of the passengers. Whatever Ms. Carter had been involved in, she hadn't done it alone. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time steadier. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Maya exchanged a glance with her father. He gave her a small nod, a silent reassurance that everything was under control now. But she wasn't sure if she believed that. Even with the authorities waiting on the ground, there were still so many unanswered questions. As the wheels touched down, The tension inside the cabin reached its peak. Passengers clutched their belongings, some stealing glances toward Ms. Carter, others just desperate to get off the plane. The flight attendants who weren't involved in whatever had happened moved quickly, preparing for arrival, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. But it was impossible. Maya's phone buzzed in her hand, and she looked down to see messages flooding in. The picture she had taken earlier had already spread. Someone must have shared it. Social media was already picking up the story. The plane taxied to the gate, and within moments, uniformed officers boarded. The murmurs turned into hushed silence as they moved swiftly down the aisle. Ms. Carter's face drained of all color, but she didn't resist as they approached her. One of the officers, a stern-looking woman with a badge clipped to her vest, stopped in front of her. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." For the first time since this all began, Ms. Carter looked afraid. "This is a misunderstanding," she started, her voice thin. "I was just following procedure." Maya's father stepped forward then, his tone calm but firm. "We'll let the authorities determine that." There was nothing left for Ms. Carter to say. She swallowed hard, then turned and walked down the aisle, flanked by officers. As she passed Maya, she hesitated for just a second, her eyes meeting hers. There was something unreadable in her gaze. Was it regret? Resentment? Then, just like that, she was gone. Passengers began clapping softly, some murmuring words of relief. A few turned to Maya, nodding in silent gratitude. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this, but for once, she didn't mind. As people started gathering their belongings, Maya leaned back in her seat, her pulse finally slowing. She could feel her father watching her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just trying to wrap my head around everything." He sighed. "You handled yourself well." She let out a small laugh, though it was still laced with nerves. "I didn't really have a choice." Her father's expression softened. "You always have a choice. And you made the right one." Maya thought about that as they gathered their bags and made their way off the plane. The airport was buzzing with activity, officers speaking with crew members, passengers stopping to recount what had happened. Even as she stepped into the terminal, she could feel the eyes on her, people whispering, recognizing her as the girl at the center of it all. She pulled out her phone again, scrolling through the flood of messages and notifications. The story was already gaining traction. News outlets were picking it up. People were demanding answers from the airline. It wasn't just about her anymore. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Come on," he said. "Let's go get some answers." Maya took one last look at the plane before nodding, following him toward the security office. This wasn't just over yet. But one thing was clear, whatever had been happening on that flight, it was about to come to light. And she had made sure of that.